right now. And for today's class, we'll be looking at JavaScript events. So we all know what an event is. Is an activity that is mostly something ongoing. Could be events we already know of. Are things like birthdays, weddings, and all those nice activities. But events here actually are different. And so we'll be looking at events with respect to JavaScript and not, the events we already know about. So for today's class, we'll be focusing on JavaScript events purely. And this means that that is the only thing we'll be looking at today. Now, under JavaScript events, we'll be getting to know what a JavaScript event is. So the event here is not something difficult. It's a very easy concept to know about. And we'll also see some examples of these JavaScript events. Also, would see what an event handler is. And from the word event handler, I, I feel many of us would already know that this means something that handles the event, the thing that performs the event. So we'll get to know what an event handler is. We'll also see some few examples of these event handlers, and we'll also get to see a code example which has where this event and handler is being used. We'll see one of those. Now, lastly, we'll get to see what an event listener is. Now, if you notice very well, we do not have event listener you know, as a section on its own, but rather we have the add event listener method. So we'll get to see what this particular method actually does. We'll also get to see the syntax and the example of this method. And at the end of this class, we'll always have a quick demo on all what we've seen, throughout today's class. So beginning with today's class, begin with JavaScript events. Now, what is a JavaScript event? In JavaScript, an event basically is an activity that occurs when a user or the browser manipulates a web page. Now, this definition is very straightforward and very basic enough for us to understand. So, here the event basically is an activity, and you know what an activity is? Something that happens, something that just, begins, something that goes on. That is what an activity actually is. And so that's what this event is. And this activity would only occur when a user manipulates the web page. And so by manipulation, we actually mean that the user performs some actions on the web page. And also the browser, when the browser manipulates the web page, an event occurs. So this means that performing actions on the web page can either be done by a user or by the browser itself. So I know for most, things we've been doing in this tutorial, we've actually looked into how a user manipulates a web page. That's a user action. But even the browser on its own can actually have a particular action it can perform on a web page depending on whatever thing it wants to process. So here we have some examples of these events, and as you can see very briefly, we just have four of them. Now events are not limited to these four. They are actually as much as a user can perform and a browser can perform. So just know this, that anything a user can perform on a web page, can be called an event. Anything a browser can also perform is also known as an event. So for the first example here, we have that to be when a page loads. Now, when a page is loading is a particular event, and this particular event occurs in such a way that when a particular web page is loading, it loads everything it contains. So by that I mean the images, the CSS files, the script files, and if it is in such a way that it has multiple HTMLs too, it loads everything, all at once. And the act of loading all those, required resources is actually known as an event. Now, this particular event of, loading a page is actually done by the browser and not the user. So our first example of an event here is not a user event, but it is rather a browser event. So that one is done by the browser. So for the next event we have, which is when a user clicks a button. Well, this one is self-explanatory, and you would know that this is a user action. A user clicks a button, the button performs something. So the act of, the button performing that thing that it will do is known as an event. Also, when a user presses a key on the keyboard, probably you want to type out something on the input field, or you just want to type out something, or you are required to press a particular key for something to, work. That is known as a user action or user event. And also, when a user closes a window, when you close the entire browser window, is also an event that just happened. So those are the list of events we have, in JavaScript. And like I said before, they are not limited to these four. There are actually a lot more. A lot. There are a lot of them. And we cannot have time to list out every single event because these events are so dynamic. And anything a user can do on the web page is considered an event. And so a user can actually do a lot of things on a web page. So I don't really think you can actually sit down to list out every single thing a user can do. But just know that these are some examples of these events, and they're actually much more than this. So JavaScript, when connected to the HTML, can react over this event. So the thing here is this: for these events to happen, they always need to affect a particular HTML element. And so when JavaScript is connected with these elements, it can actually react with the elements, with the following events. Now, the process of JavaScript reacting to these events that have taken place, which could be a person clicking a button, you resizing the browser window, or you performing a particular action on that web page. It could even be as simple as typing your name in an input field. That is also an event. So you perform that event, JavaScript can react to it. And now the process of reacting to this event is known as event handling. So what this means is that JavaScript itself would react to these events by handling them. And so therefore, event handling here can be done through event handlers in JavaScript. So looking at the notes we have on the screen, you can actually see that event handling can be done via event handlers in JavaScript. So the event handlers here are the ones that, perform the operation to be executed once that action has occurred. So in the next slide, we'd actually get to know what an event handler is. So what is an event handler? An event handler in JavaScript is actually a code that invokes a specific block of code to be executed when a particular action occurs. So you can see here that the event handler is actually a type of code that would call a specific block of code. Now that block of code could be a simple code or it could be an actual function. Most times it will be a function. And so the moment a user performs a particular action, if the particular element where the action is being performed has an event handler, that event handler would invoke a block of code to be executed the moment that user performs that action. So that's what an event handler basically is. Its job there is just to, stay with the element and wait for the element to perform an action. The moment that action takes place, it connects it to the block of code that would execute. So that's what an event handler is. Now we have examples of event handlers. And in actual sense, the event handlers in JavaScript are actually a lot. I guess there are about 100 plus or even more than that. And so, for the sake of simplicity, I actually decided to go over event handlers in terms of their categories. So, the event handlers we'll be seeing today are divided into categories of events they affect. So, this means that these event handlers are actually categorized based on the kind of event they can, perform. That's as a group. Some of them can perform mouse events, some can perform keyboard events, some can perform form events, and some can perform the entire window event. So you can see on the screen very briefly, we have some of these events categories. And the first category here is the mouse event. Now, this mouse event is actually regarding to the mouse cursor. That's the pointer, this moving pointer. So this moving pointer here, actually connects with this mouse event. Next, we have the keyboard event. And this event is connected to any action that is performed with your keyboard. So I said before that when you are typing out something on an input field, you do that with the keyboard. So that kind of action can be connected to a keyboard event. Next, we have the form event. And the events here are actually connected to forms, what you want a particular form to do in different situations. You can actually set it in such a way that when you click the submit button of a form, a particular event happens. When a user types in a wrong input into an input field, probably you created an input for email and the user went and typed first name there. Of course, that should give you an error. And so when a user does that and clicks on the submit button or he leaves that particular input element, a particular event should occur that will tell the user, oh, what you did here was wrong. What is required here is an email and not a name, or you need a valid email to fill in this field. So things like that are under the form event. Now the last event we have here is the window slash document event, and the events here are actually related to events you could perform on the entire browser window as a whole. So that's like the entire screen you are seeing that's on the browser. So they also have their own events too. So the categories of events in JavaScript are not limited to these four, but there are a lot of them, and I just feel we should at least begin by knowing what these four categories can actually do with their event handlers. So the first event we'll be looking at is the mouse event. So here we have the mouse event, and as you can see on the screen, we have the event handler and we also have the event they perform. So our first event handler here is the onClick event handler, and this particular handler performs a click event. So the click event here is actually connected to when a user clicks on a HTML element. Now, if we were there in yesterday's class, I made you know a particular button to display to I made the display of a particular button to be hidden, and I did that by making use of this event handler. So in case we do not know about that, I'll be going over this particular event handler again. And so this one does the event of clicking. Now the next event handler we have is the on mouse over event handler. And this event handler performs the event of mouse over. And mouse over here actually describes when a user moves the pointer over a HTML element. So it just basically talks about when the user moves the pointer over a particular element. So you can call that something like hovering. That's when we did CSS. You know, when a user hovers over it, this particular event handler can perform any event you want at that moment. So the next one we have is the on mouse out. And the on mouse out here performs the mouse out event. And this event describes when a user moves the mouse pointer out of that element. So the second one we saw was to move the mouse over the element, and the one we are seeing now is when you move the mouse out of the element. So now we are not even clicking on the element, just hovering over it and removing the mouse from the element can actually perform a particular event. Yes, just doing that alone can perform an event. So the next one we have is the on mouse down event. And this describes when a user holds down the mouse pointer on a HTML element. So just imagine you um left click on a particular element and you keep holding down, that pointer. The more you keep holding it down, events could be performing as you keep doing that. And so the event here is the mouse down event. So next we have the on mouse up event. And the on mouse up is the opposite of on mouse down. So the mouse down here is pressing down, that's right clicking or left clicking on the HTML element. That's like holding down the pointer, and then the moment you release your finger from the mouse button, it can perform a mouse up event. So the last one we have here is the on mouse move event, and this describes when a user moves the pointer on an HTML element while the page is moving. So let's assume you are scrolling or you are moving the entire page. The moment the mouse just goes over it in the process of the page moving, it can perform a particular event. So that's that with mouse events. The next set of events we have is the keyboard event, and this particular event affect any kind of keyboard action. So very briefly, we have about three of them, but this might not be all of them, but these are the basic ones we need to know of. And so we have the event handler under the keyboard event. To begin with, the on key up event, or the on key up event handler. And this particular event handler performs an action when a user releases a key on the keyboard. So the opposite of this event is actually the on key down, which is the next event handler. And so the on key down here refers to when a user holds down a key on the keyboard. So it's something like, pressing a key on the keyboard and not releasing your finger. You doing that alone, you can perform an action or an event with the on key down event handler. And the moment you release your finger from that key on the keyboard, it can perform an event with the on key up event handler. So the on key up and the on key down are actually opposite events, but they are quite connected. So lastly, we have the on key press event handler, and this particular one occurs when you just press a key and release your hand immediately. So this could affect you doing your random typing, on your keyboard, just your normal typing when you're pressing keys. So events can actually be happening as you are doing those things. And this can actually be important when you're trying to fill in an input field that requires a Gmail, and let's assume a user just types in a name without adding the at gmail.com attachment. The moment the user tries to leave the whole place, you can just quickly send him an alert that you must use a valid Gmail. The Gmail isn't complete. You need to add an extension, which could be at gmail.com, at Yahoo Mail, at any kind of mail. So that's just one of the instances where this keyboard event can be used. Next, we have the form event, and the form event also has its event handlers. So we have the onChange event handler, and the onChange event handler here, you know, it performs the change event, which can occur when a user changes a selected option of a select element. So now within a form, there's something called a select element, which we can use to select, we can use that to list out different kind of, items, and would allow a user to select one of these items. So the moment a user selects a particular item, you can perform a particular event when a user does so with the onChange event handler. Next, we have the onFocus event handler here, and here it actually describes when a user focuses on a particular input field. So by focus here, it actually means a particular field that currently has focus. That's the field that the user is currently filling, or the field the user just currently clicked on. So you can perform an event when a user clicks on an input field. Also, we have the onInput event handler, And this particular one affects an input field also, but it does so when a user types something in the input field. So here you can perform an event when a user is typing on an input field. Probably you can perform a regex expression to check if the user is typing out a valid Gmail or a valid phone number or a valid, username, or a username that has existed before in your database and you don't want the user using that username again. You can do that with the onInput event handler. So next we have the onInvalid event handler. And this one actually describes when an input field is invalid. So if you have an invalid input field, you can send a message across to a particular user using this event handler. We also have the onReset event handler, and this event handler actually resets the entire form. So let's assume you had filled the entire form and you feel you wanted to change every detail you've put there to something new. With this event handler, you can do so. It would reset the entire form, every single thing there. And lastly, here we have the onSubmit event handler, which I would say is the mostly used event handler within a form. And this particular one describes what should happen when a form is submitted. So when you submit a form and you want to perform a particular event, you can do that with the onSubmit event handler. So next we have the Windows event. And the Windows event here refer to the browser window. So here we have briefly some event handlers that are connected to the window event, and one of them is the onload event handler, and this particular one handles you know the event of the entire page loading. That's when a web page loads, you know a web page that has CSS, JavaScript and images. When you load a web page, all those resources would have to load at the same time so that they can all be rendered once once you load it. So you can do that with the onload event handler. We also have the onload event handler, and this actually describes when a browser window is unloaded. It is also the direct opposite of the first one, which is onload. And the onload here describes when the browser window is closed. So the first one describes when the page is open. The other one for when the page is closed or the browser window is closed. We also have the onResize event handler, and this performs the action of resizing the browser window. You could use that too in JavaScript. But I know many of us now, we already know about media queries, which already performs, changes to our website when we resize the page. Well, in JavaScript, you can do it using this too. Also, we have the on page show, and this event handler affects a page when a user is navigating through that web page. So when a user is navigating through a web page, you can use the on page show to perform any event you want. And it is also the direct opposite of the last event handler, which is on page hide. And the hide here is when a user navigates away from the page. So this means when the user leaves the page, now leaving the page does not mean that the page has been closed. The page is still existing, but the user isn't on the page anymore. So it's like you clicking on a link in a particular web page and the link directs you to another page. So you can actually use the on page hide to perform some events on the page you just left. So that's that with event handlers, and here is a quick example of how you can use an event handler. So on the screen here we have two sets of examples, and you can see that the very first one is it has a smaller syntax compared to the next one. So the very first one here, we made use of the onClick event handler. And so this onClick event handler is within the heading 4 elements. We know what a heading 4 element is. It's used to, print out text. And so within the heading 4 element, we have a text which says my name is. Now, we do not know what the name is, but all we know is that it shows my name is, and we do not want the user to know what the name is until the user clicks on this element. So we make use of the onClick event here, and the onClick event handler is assigned the this keyword. So for those who were in yesterday's class, I said that the this keyword is actually used to represent the entire object. So this means that the heading 4 element here is an object. We know why the heading 4 is an object. When I treated the DOM, I said that all HTML elements are objects under the DOM. And so the most superior object there is the HTML, elements, and then other objects are within either the head or the body. So I wouldn't be diving into DOM again, but just know that all elements are objects. And so here, this particular this keyword we have here, the THIS here, refers to the entire heading 4 object. And so referring to this object, we want to affect this text content we have here. And you know how we do that already. We make use of the dot inner HTML, you know, what's it called, property. That's this particular one. And so setting this to John Doe means that when the user clicks on this particular text rendered on the screen, the text here would actually change to John Doe. So this is an example of how the onClick element can be performed. Very easy and simple, and this is like a shorter method to do so. So in the next example here, we would also generate the same results we have here. But the difference between these two examples is the fact that the first one has the JavaScript aspect embedded within the HTML elements right here, everything. But here in the second example, we actually have the onClick event handler being assigned a function name. So this function, this replace text here is actually a function name, and this keyword here is actually an argument within this function name. So here we are calling the function name, and you know that when we call a function name, we pass in an argument, into the function in as much as a parameter already exists. So the argument here is the this keyword itself. And so this particular syntax would be stored in our .html file and not in the JS file. So unlike the first example, you would have everything in the HTML file, but here you would have only this in the HTML file. And then in your JavaScript, you would have your function declaration there. And so we have the function replace text function name. Now we have our parameter, which is x, and we have a code which says x.innerHTML would be equals to John Doe. So the moment we call this function with this event handler, this particular this keyword, which represents the entire heading 4 element, will be passed into this x parameter. And so you can say that this is equivalent to saying this dot inner html as we have it here in the first example. So here we would have x dot inner html. The x here represents this. So x dot inner html equals to John Doe, and we would have the same result we had in the first example. So these are the two ways to use an event handler. Whichever one is convenient for you, you can make use of. But it is always advisable that you have your, you know, JS code being separated from the HTML. And some people consider it better using the second method than the first method. Next, we have the add event listener method. So this method here is an event listener, and it's also going to be the only event listener we'll be seeing in today's class. So there are more event listeners out there, but we'll be seeing the one that can add an event listener into your HTML element. So the add event listener method here is used to attach an event to a particular HTML element. So very quickly, the add event listener here and the event handlers, they kind of perform the same kind of operations but in different ways and with different syntax. So making use of this method here does not override any existing event handler. So this means that you can have a HTML element with some event handlers and also with an event listener added to it. So the event listener here would not override the event handler. You can have them within your elements at the same time. So here the syntax of what the add event listener looks like, and the syntax begins with the element here. After the element, we have our event listener method, which is the add event listener. And within the parentheses, we have the particular event we want to perform and also a function. Now, breaking the syntax down, the event here actually doesn't represent the actual event, the element name. The element here that's within the syntax, it's actually used to reference the HTML element and not the direct name of the element. So we've already seen some methods of referencing using some of the DOM methods, the document.getElement by ID, document.getElement by class name, by tag name, or by name. You can use any of these references or any of these methods to reference your HTML element. So the next part of the syntax we have is the add event listener, which is the actual method itself. We already know about that. So after that, we have the event section, which is within the parentheses. And so the event here actually represents a specific event to be performed. So far so good. We've seen some event handlers and we've seen some of the events they all perform. But here, the event here doesn't represent the event handler. No, it represents the event you want it to perform, which is why I said the event handlers and the event listeners, they perform the same thing but in different ways. So here we'll be making use of the name of the event we want to perform. And lastly, in the syntax, we have the function, and this specifies the code to be executed when the event occurs. And so this function here can be referenced by the function name itself. So that's how brief and easy the syntax is. So here is a brief example of we making use of the add event listener method. And as you can see here, we made use of the button HTML element. Now within the button, we have an ID of btn. And so in order to add an event to this button, we would reference this by the ID. We already know how to do that with the document.get element by ID btn. Now, if you notice very well, we do not have .inner HTML following this, ID name, which we've always been seeing before. But instead, we have the add event listener being the property or the method attached to this and not inner HTML. So you add the event listener here, and within the parentheses, in where we have the event, we have the click event. Now, you need to understand this very well. Here we have the click event, and the event handler that performs this event is the on click. But here we do not have the event handler, we rather have the name of the event we want to perform. So the name of the event here is click, but the event handler for this event is on click. But since we are not making use of the event handlers, we are making use of the add event listener method. So for the add event listener method, we would have the name of the event, and it is followed also by the function. So here we have the function name, and the only thing different here with this function name is the fact that it doesn't have parentheses. So I guess that's how the syntax actually appears to be. No parentheses, just the function name appearing there directly. And so the next thing you do is to create the function, and then you would have the code you want to perform when the user clicks on that button. So within our function here, we are performing an alert operation, and the alert here says hello user. So this hello user here would be displayed in a dialog box that would appear, that's at the top of our screen. At the middle, you would see the dialog box appear, and it would only appear when we click this button on screen. So I can see that we've come to the end of this particular section with the slide. So you know what the next section is, which is having a quick demo on events so far. So we'll be going on to VS Code, and I'll be showing you guys how the event handlers and event listeners actually work. Okay, so we'd have a folder for this, and this will be events. So I know what we've seen today is quite a lot, but trust me, it's very easy to understand, and you would see how it actually works when I start, putting it out. So I'll be making use of the P element. We could use a heading element, one we want. And so the first event we'll be seeing would be the click event, which is under the mouse event. So for this paragraph tag, I would have the on click event here. That's the event handler. I'll set this to this dot inner HTML. Okay, so before we do this, let's have a text inside. And I would say click to review. So I'll open with live server so we can see what we have. And you can see we have click to review here. So now if I click on it, or you know I hover over it, nothing happens at all. So here I would say this dot inner HTML. And this would be equals to anything we want. I'll change this to John Doe. And so for this example, we are performing the onClick event. That's the We are using the onClick event handler to perform a click event. And so this click event doesn't only work on links or buttons, but it also works on any HTML element. So we are here now, hovering over it, nothing happens. But if I should click this now, you can see we have John Doe. And mind you, this is not a button. This is a heading 3 text. I mean a paragraph, element. If I should reload this now, it takes us to click to reveal. If I click this to perform the click event, it gives us John Doe. So that's how simple and easy this is. We could also have this to be within a button. I would say click to hide. This would be to hide this button. And so we'll make use of the onClick event handler, and instead of using the inner HTML, I'll connect this to the display. So I will say dot style dot display. The display here will be set to none. So when I click this button here, it should actually not display anymore. And you can see it's gone. If I click this, we have John Doe, hide. So that's how an event handler actually works. Very simple and easy to use. So I'll be making use of some mouse event handlers. So we have the on mouse down, and so if I should click this, it gives us John Doe. That's how the on mouse down event handler works. And mind you, we can even have multiple event handlers. So for this, I will have the down and the up. So the on mouse up should give us something also. And we'll set this to change the name to something else when we release our hand from, pressing it down. And we'll have this to be having the text here, say Jane Doe. And so going back to our browser, if I click this or if I hold it down, we have John Doe. And you can see I'm holding it down since I'm able to, highlight this. The moment I release my finger, it changes to Jane Doe. So that's how it actually works. If I click, it shows John Doe. If I release, Jane Doe. So you can see we have John Doe, Jane Doe, John Doe, Jane Doe. And I will add one more, which is the mouse over event handler. And this would only affect the elements when we have the pointer hovering over it. Okay, okay. So I would only be adding a property. I wouldn't change the text for this. I would say dot color. Color here would be red. So when we hover over it, we should have a red text. Only just hovering. And you can see I just hovered over it and choose a red text. I've not I've not clicked on it. I just put the pointer on any text within the content area and it just hovers. No clicking, just hovering.
Nah, I can't see screen now. Hello, sir. We can't follow you. We cannot see it. Sorry about that.
Okay, okay. So for this, I added the on mouse over. And I said the on mouse over here would only affect the elements when we hover over it. So adding the on mouse over, you can see we have this red text here. So if I should reload this page, now the moment this pointer lands on this HTML text, which is click to reveal, it just goes into red color immediately.
So, yeah. It's back now.
Okay, you can all see the screen.
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, so some of these events are actually related to the mouse event, and so I'll be adding one last one, which is the on. The opposite of the on mouse over is the on mouse out. Yeah, the on mouse out. So I would say this dot style. So this would actually affect it the moment the pointer leaves the text. So the on mouse out should have a color of blue. Yeah. So I go back here and I reload our page. And if I should hover on it, we have red, take it out blue, red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, red, blue. Is quite dynamic. When we put the pointer on it, it's red. When we leave, it's blue. You put it again red, you leave, you have blue. And funny enough, we still have mouse, mouse down and mouse up. So if I should hold this, it changes to Jane Doe. If I should release John Doe, Jane Doe. So the mouse up and down still works for this text, and likewise the mouse over and mouse out. So you can have multiple event handlers within, an element. So I know many of you might be saying, of course, we can do this with CSS, but then I don't think CSS can do, something like this when you hover and change the color of the text, or you could even hover over it like this and the text content could actually be changing. And the changes you can apply here can actually go as far as what you actually want to do. So we are only doing something just as basic as changing the color and changing the text when we click and when we release. So I think that's enough with mouse events. Now let's get to see how we can do this with a particular function. That's the second method. So I will take all of this away. Okay, so we just have our casual paragraph tag with click to reveal. If I click, if I hover, nothing happens. We've taken out all those event handlers. So for this, we'll give this you know, an ID. So we'll have the on click here. We'll give this a function name. So let's just call this my func. With this function name, we'll have this keyword. This here represents pa- the entire paragraph element. So within our JavaScript, we'll have the actual function being created. Function my function. Also the curly braces. So because we have the this keyword here, we would like to pass that by making use of one parameter, at least one. So I'll call my parameter here x, then I would say x dot inner HTML should change the text to undo. So this should perform exactly the same operation we saw before, exactly the same thing, nothing different. So if I click to review John Doe, so it performs the same thing. So if I were to have multiple event handlers in this form, instead of having that very long syntax that span to, beyond what we can see on the screen, I will just have, you know, mouse down, and I'll give this a function. I'll call this down function. This, if I also want the on mouse up, I'll call this up func. We also have this. So depending on the event we are performing, anyone connected to any of these handlers would actually perform a particular action. So I'll just copy all of this. Here would have the down func, here we'll have the up func. So for the down func, I want, when we click on it, it should change the text to something else. May we do, when we release our hand, that's when we release our finger from the mouse. We'll change the style, set the style to have a color of green. So going back to this page, if I click, we have Merido, John Doe. So it keeps going, Merido and John Doe. And we now have a permanent green color here. If you want to take this out, you can actually do that using the on mouse out. So I think that's that with this particular you know mouse event. I'd like for us to look into keyboard events. Comment all of this. We don't need this anymore. So I have a very brief form for this. Okay, so this will be the underscore name, the last name. Okay, let's see how the form looks like. Okay, so we have this form. Okay, so we have a very brief form with a first name, last name, and a submit button. Okay, so this is the form we have now. And so for the keyboard event, that's within the input, within the input element, can have the on key up or the on key up or down. This will be this. So I'll make use of a function for this. Call this. We have my function we've used before. So I'll make use of that. That's this we have here. So within this my function, we want to affect the text that will be typed into the input field. And so to reference the text, we don't need this anymore. We'll do this by the normal way we reference stuff, and that's with the document.get element by ID. So you wouldn't need this parameter. It will be document.get element by ID. And why we are doing this is probably because you cannot affect an input field directly, since an input field is not a HTML, element for outputting text. So you have to use this method to do it. So the ID name here is f underscore name, f underscore name. So we've connected to the input field. And so the next thing I'll do is to assign this to a value. I mean a variable name. Let's say a variable name of x. So x now would represent this particular input we have here. And so we then reference the value of the input field by saying x dot value, and now we can actually apply what we want. So I could say x dot value dot to uppercase, and this should actually change any text that is being typed into that field into uppercase. So we are making use of the key up. So let's type. Okay, so this doesn't work out. Let's check what we did not do well. Okay, we have this to be my function. We also have this here. Okay, so this didn't actually work. Let me try doing it directly here. So actually, this actually worked when last I used it, but then let's just quickly see the form submit button. I think that would be the form, the on submit handler. On submit will also have its own function. That form was submitted. This one should actually work out, hopefully, when we submit this form. Okay, so I say John and do. We are expected to have a kind of dialog box when we click the submit. Okay, yes, so this works. So it says your form was submitted, and we press OK, it resets it automatically. So here the on submit event handler works. I really don't know why the one for the text refused to kick in. Jane Doe form was submitted. Okay, so this works. Next one I'll be doing will be the on reset. And I said this particular one will reset the entire form irrespective of whatever you've typed in. So I'll duplicate some of this. Here we have email, password. Type here will be email. Here would be password. We will have another input button again, and this would be with the type reset. Okay, so we have this on the screen. So I will change this to your form. Instead of submitted, this will be your form was reset, or was reset. So we're just having some content here, and then just a random password. You click reset, it says your form was reset and everything would go out. Yeah, So that's how submit the reset can actually work. I really wish we could try out more, but there isn't that much time. So let's quickly look at event, the add event listener. So for the add event listener, we're making use of the button. This quite easy. You give this an ID. ID will be btn. Say click here. Never. So we click here, nothing happens. So go back to our JavaScript and would create a function that would connect to that ID we have there. So connect to the button first, which is with our document.get element by ID. The ID name we have that to be btn. And then we add the event listener. So the event we'll be performing would be a click event, not you know not the on click event handler, just the click event. And you can see a list of events here you can perform. Here we'll be using the click event. I'll also connect this with our function, but just the function name. The next thing we do here obviously is to create the function we have. Here we perform what we want, you know. As I would say alert, you just clicked the button. And so when a user clicks that button, this should give us a dialog box that would appear here that would tell us that we just clicked this button. If I do this, it says so, you just click the button. Now we could also affect the text inside, but we would need to reference that using the DOM method here. To be document or get element by ID with the btn, which is the ID name, dot inner html. You can set this to already clicked. So this would run this when you click the button to give you this dialog box, and then the next thing you would have is the text changing to already clicked. So if I click here, we have our dialog box. Once I press OK, it tells us we've already clicked this button. But of course, we can still click again and it would still tell us we've already clicked. So you can actually add a kind of, you know, function that would just enable a user to click just once. And once a user has clicked on this, he can't click on it a second time. But because we do not have that here, we can click on this. It will tell us we've already clicked the button and we could still go on over and over again. Okay, so that's how we have it with the add event listener. And this actually works with, the events and not the event handlers. So here you would have all the different events you could use in, JavaScript. You can see all the events we have, and I believe all these events have their respective event handlers. That is if you don't want to make use of this method. But then, no, I don't think we do. Okay, you can see the key up, the key press, the key down, which, well, never worked. And we also have the mouse down we've used. We have the mouse move, the mouse out, the mouse over, the mouse up. So here we have the events, and you can also make use of the event handlers. So I think we can call it a day. Thank you, and I hope to see you in the next class.